join us today can do so in the future. Again, thanks to all of you for joining us for the lunchtime lecture series. You see on your screen right now myself and Cara Thuringer, who is a master's student at the School for Environment and Sustainability. And she will be chiming in after Thomas Mitchell's talk concludes with a few questions and comments that are framed in dialogue with her peers as learners on our campus, particularly graduate and professional learners who are moving into work on the increasingly overlapping and intersecting fields of environmental justice and response to environmental crises in climate change, water availability, land use, food supply systems, and so on. We are experimenting with this particular time as a way of convening folks around our campus and on allied campuses and programs around the country who are working in this space, and all of us together converting this pandemic's constraints into opportunities to build communities in new ways on the work that we know needs to be done in order to face the major challenges of our time. I was trained as an anthropologist, and I've worked primarily in Africa, but not uniquely. It's thus that I ended up meeting our speaker for today, Thomas Mitchell, years ago, in fact, through a phenomenal group that I was a part of called the Association for Law, Property, and Society. And I'll touch back on that group in just a moment, but I want to say that it's a group that taught me a great deal about the power of genuinely cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary thinking on these questions. Here at UMSEAS, the School for Environment and Sustainability at University of Michigan, we are a very diverse faculty by any metric, whether it's gender and ethno-linguistic and cultural identities, first-generation scholars, disciplinary trainings. We have a great deal of work going on in our school across boundaries that include environmental humanities, social science, natural science. Our environmental justice program is itself a degree program, but it is also a certificate community. And so for those of you who might be joining us from other units and programs on the University of Michigan campus today, please do bear in mind that if you're interested, or your students and colleagues are interested in either offering courses through our certificate program or taking courses and earning a certificate from our program to complement your existing master's or PhD degree, you are welcome to reach out to me at rdharden@umich.edu with questions about that. I do accept applications, and we do review them with our Office of Academic Programs. I believe the next deadline is in April of this year for admission into our certificate program next year, and we are happy to have a growing rank of people from across different fields coming together around environmental justice. Let me come back to the Association for Law, Property, and Society for just a moment and talk about that as a really remarkable group. It brought me together initially with Thomas Mitchell, and I've been hoping to bring him to our school for quite some time. I think the work that he's going to share today will be a reminder to all of us of the extent to which land dispossession is an unfolding process, as is alienation and dispossession of people from their labor. The experiences of peoples of color and indigenous peoples in our country are rife with these kinds of debts, these kinds of processes that are processes of impoverishment that unfold across generations. I'm very grateful to my students and to my collaborators in the environmental justice program at UMSEAS for the ways in which we are thinking about how to best acknowledge those realities when we open events like this. Many of you know that a land acknowledgement is fairly standard practice, and it's important practice right now. But the students who are working with me on this series have opted to hold off on the Acknowledgement Act in this series and to do it towards the end, closer to the end of the hour, when it can be done, in fact, in dialogue with the work of our speakers and with the material that's sort of on the table for that day, and in that way become a reflection, not a pro forma speech, but rather a really serious moment of pause and reflection on how do we, in our work as scholars and engaged activists, how do we acknowledge the violence that undergirds many of the institutions that are platforms from which we now speak today. So that will be coming up, and Cara Thuringer will be doing a bit more work with that material towards the end of our talk today. But before we get started, I want to just introduce Thomas himself to all of you who may not know him or know his work. You're in for a treat. Thomas is someone who illustrates that very range I spoke about in terms of knowledge forms in his own work. He started out, if I'm not mistaken, as a college student at Amherst College, and he was actually an English and literature student, if I'm not mistaken, which again speaks to this, this arc, right? Because what he did then was to go to Howard University Law School for his LLM degree, and then on to the University of Wisconsin Law School, where he later became faculty, in fact, the Frederick W. and Vi Miller Chair in Law. Then in 2016, he segued from the University of Wisconsin to the law faculty at Texas A&M University. And now he has a joint appointment at Texas A&M, both as a professor of law, but also as a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics. So for those of you learners and educators out there who are feeling a bit schizophrenic as you blend critical perspectives from the environmental humanities with an interest in policy or practice or food production or infrastructure, please know that Mitchell himself is a beacon. That career arc is a comforting reminder to all of us that in order to address injustice in ways that enable people to come together in this moment and confront environmental crisis of our times, it entails traversing and combining knowledge forms, from professional schools to basic research, from natural to social science, humanities to engaged work on human rights and policy, indeed indigenous knowledges as well, many of which constitute a body of knowledge out of which science itself was built. So I want to say just that is a running theme in this lecture series on Thursdays. And last week's lecture with Cara Tyler also did a wonderful job of asking us to think about the ways in which different kinds of knowledge can and must combine in this moment. Mitchell himself works on legal causes of loss by Black Americans, land loss by Black Americans, and has shown that between the Civil War and the year 1910, Black Americans came to possess about 15 million acres of land in the South, but that's declined dramatically in recent decades. Mitchell shows us legal processes by which the losses occur, and the laws that govern inheritance have a role in that. His work, A Legal Empiricist Approach, looks at how laws are enacted and their consequences on the ground. To me, as an ethnographer and anthropologist, that is a really important methodological contribution to interdisciplinary studies of land loss and marginalized groups in particular. It's a fundamentally cross-disciplinary endeavor, and it links to these engaged scholarship practices, another way in which Mitchell is a beacon. As Cara Tyler noted last week in the talk that will be appearing as a recording soon on our UMSEAS website, there is, in her words, an ally industrial complex in this country right now. Many people are recognizing that Black, Indigenous, peoples of color, they have suffered enormous injustices that need to be addressed and confronted. But we must go beyond mere allyship or analysis to be genuine, as she put it, accomplices in acts of change. Here too, Mitchell is a beacon. He was the principal drafter of the Partition Heirs Property Act, which has been adopted in, Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong, 18 states to date. I bet that number is increasing all the time.
Yes.
You're also, I think, Thomas, the second African-American to have served as a reporter for the Uniform Law Commission in its over 120-year history, which is just, it's, a striking fact. Mitchell was named in 2020 a Macarthur Fellow, which some of you may know as previously known as the Genius Awards from the Macarthur Foundation. And I cannot, as his colleague and his, fellow traveler in the Association for Law, Property, and Society work over the years, I cannot think of a better awardee. Because of these blends of knowledge forms that you represent, Thomas, because of the blend of intervention and practice with scholarship that you represent, it is our honor and our pleasure to welcome you here today for our lunchtime lecture series. Welcome, join us. I'll let you share the screen as a panelist, and thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca. Sorry that it wasn't very genius. I was a faculty member at University of Wisconsin for 16 years, and I always think of Michigan as being right next to Wisconsin and Central Time, but of course I was wrong. So let me just, I have prepared a PowerPoint, and let me just pull that up and kind of go through that. Just 1 second.
And that looks great on our end. Yeah.
Yeah, I made one little mistake.
No problem.
Oh. I had it, and then I didn't.
It's so funny that this is happening because last week with Shakara Tyler, we also had a funny pause where we were having trouble getting the screen sharing to work right. It seems to be almost a rhythm.
Yeah.
While you're doing that, I'm just going to encourage folks to use the question and answer feature. It's Cara Thuringer will be helping me moderate in ways that Cara has a lot of experience with based on her previous work with the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I am really honored and delighted to have Cara working with me on this event today. And I wanted to just let you all know that while the chat is open and we're happy to have contributions to the chat, which was very rich at last week's talk and involved a lot of resource sharing. It was great. The Q&A feature allows us to be sure we build in your burning questions as you watch Thomas Mitchell's materials unfold and you hear him speaking. If you have thoughts, that's probably the best place to make sure that you get a chance to pose that question or that we can weave it into the comments and questions that we're building for Thomas as the presentation unfolds. The webinar format, as you all know, is pretty formal in some ways, but it's worked for us pretty well, and it does keep the events both convivial but also secure and structured enough that in this short amount of time we can get some good thinking done together. So thanks for your collaboration on that.
Yeah, Rebecca, I think I'm good now. Do you guys see the screen?
Not quite yet. You're going to have to share it, I think.
Oh.
But we did see it earlier, so whatever you were doing before will work. Great. That looks great. And yeah. Perfect.
Okay, sorry. All right, let me just try to launch into this. So my work kind of focused, starting about 25 years ago, on doing research on kind of Black land ownership and the trying to come up with a better understanding of the pathways that have led to significant Black land loss. So just kind of as background, obviously African Americans, while they were enslaved in this country, had the status of being property and were forbidden from owning property. But then we had, towards the end of the Civil War, you had General Sherman's Field Order Number 15, popularly known as the 40 acres and a mule order, which purported to authorize the transfer of 400,000 acres of agricultural land between Charleston, South Carolina, and the St. Johns River in Florida. That 40 acres and a mule was short-lived. President Andrew Johnson reneged on that promise, and 9 months later, by the fall of 1865, but that 40 acres and mules has this kind of iconic status, right, of what it represents in our country, and particularly the African American community, as a call for justice in terms of kind of land issues and property ownership. But despite President Johnson reneging on that promise, fewer Americans know that between 1865 and about 1920, African Americans managed to acquire between 16 and 20 million acres of land. And this land acquisition can really only be described as heroic. Not only did African American landowners face violence, actual and threatened, disproportionately, actually, the victims of lynching in this country were the African American middle and upper middle class, who at that time, 80% of that group of African Americans were African American landowners. And they also faced, denial of credit, the refusal of many whites to sell the property to themselves. So that incredible achievement in terms of land ownership, unfortunately, has been severely eroded. The latest agricultural census shows that there are African American farmers own something like 3 million acres of land. If you look at kind of graphically, from the high water mark in about 1920, where there were, over 925,000 African American farm owners in this country, we're now down to 45,000. Obviously, that's a huge, huge loss. So, and part of what my work was looking at, well, what were the pathways to that loss? And obviously there was this extra legal violence, but I kind of then focused on what were some legal processes that led to this forcible transfer of this African American land. And essentially there were, 4 or 5 biggies, like foreclosure, eminent domain, the law of adverse possession, tax sales. But one of the things I focused on, and this really reflected the kind of the bottom-up nature of my research, is something called partition sales of heirs property. And what I wanted to focus on for your group, this thread of my research that was kind of bottom up, is the importance of this is that when I began my research, 25 years ago, this was a phenomenon that was totally invisible in terms of the legal profession. None of the major case books in terms of property law in law school or any of the major treatises kind of described this phenomenon at all. If you utilize the databases lawyers rely on, Lexis and Westlaw, there was only one case I found that was an appellate court case that specifically discussed an African American owner of rural land who had lost their property as a result of this partition sale. And I first kind of discovered this phenomenon when I was traveling in North Carolina. This was in the period where there was a proposed settlement of the Black Farmers class action lawsuit known as the Pigford case. And ostensibly, I went to this meeting to meet Black farmers. I thought, based upon how the media was portraying the Pigford case, they were, it was on 60 Minutes, New York Times, Washington Post, every, major kind of media outlet. And they were very much framing it as reparations. And I was quite shocked to find that these farmers could not have been any angrier. And when they explained it to me, then I understood what their complaints were. Essentially, they were saying that as a result of systematic, decades-long USDA discrimination, many of these farmers had been driven out of farming. They lost their farm operations, and a result, for many of them, they lost their land too, typically due to foreclosure, because as a result of the USDA discrimination, they were denied loans and other important access to important USDA programs that help farmers sustain themselves. And the payments under the Pigford class action were limited to $50,000, which these farmers then explained to me that couldn't even buy a used tractor. But during the breaks in the meeting, somebody had announced that I was this lawyer, and then some families came up to me and they started talking about their heirs property problem. So heirs property is property that transfers from one generation to the next, typically when a family doesn't make a will or estate plan. And the lack of making a will or estate plan is incredibly prevalent in the African American community. During the period of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, there were hardly any Black lawyers. Few white lawyers wanted to represent Black clients, especially in the rural South. And as a result, as a practical matter, African Americans, in terms of their property relationships, had little ability to structure their ownership in ways that made rational sense, or to develop wills or estate plans that would ensure that they owned their property under a secure ownership structure, and that they then made plans in terms of the intergenerational transfer. But when these families started telling me about, okay, so that's called heirs property, and they started telling me about how they were losing their property, essentially they were saying that, oftentimes either an outside speculator or developer or some distant member of their family would file this lawsuit and then request a court to order the forced sale of the property, even when everyone else in the family wanted to maintain ownership. And then they were telling me the courts would typically order the forced sale, and that the sale would return pennies on the dollar. No textbook that I ever looked at described that phenomenon. frankly, when the families told me this, I was very polite with them, but I thought they were unsophisticated. And I said something like, well, when I get back to Madison, let me do some research and I'll get back to you. But I really was thinking that they just fundamentally misunderstood how the law worked. It just couldn't work based upon my legal education. When I got back to Madison, I checked all the textbooks and treatises, and once again, I didn't find anything in those books that described what the families in North Carolina had told me. But before dismissing the families altogether, I asked one or two of the families, I said, you know, could you send me the court records from the trial court? And the key insight here is that in this Westlaw and Lexis, if it's a state court opinion, the only state court opinions that are reported are at the appellate level, not the trial court. And so they sent me these court records, and I was shocked to discover that everything the families had told me in North Carolina actually was how the law worked on the ground. And that began kind of my research in this area, and then later on contributed to my land reform. So this is just kind of a selection of photos. You know, once in Albany, Georgia, where I was meeting with a black operation that was processing pecans. Once in Tillery, North Carolina, with somebody who's you know, quite well known as an activist on kind of black farm issues in North Carolina, also on environmental justice issues, Gary Grant. And then you have a picture from Eastern North Carolina and Alabama and South Carolina. So let me just kind of do a quick review of the points in this slide. So this so-called heirs property ownership, and this is, like I said, property that gets transferred typically without the making of a will, is known among lawyers who, in relevant disciplines, in real estate law, and wills, trust, and estates law, or business associations law, as the most unstable form of common real property ownership recognized in the United States, largely because of that law of partition, where just one member of the common ownership group, and we're talking about heirs property, this is what we call undivided property or fractional ownership. So nobody in the ownership group owns any particular part of the property. It's like owning shares in a corporation. You own a fractional share of the overall land or property. And it's unstable because any one member of the common ownership group can file this action called a partition action and then request that the court resolve it by ordering a forced sale. And courts were commonly doing that. There's some other problems with this ownership beyond the partition. I just have the slides up, but let me kind of, in the interest of time, kind of skip over those points. So one of the things that slightly transfer to making the move from publishing scholarship in the area to actually trying to get legal reform. And I'll just note that when I first published in this area, it was an article in Northwestern University's Law Review back in 2000 or 2001. You know, it's very interdisciplinary. I kind of drew on some of my field studies, but I also took seriously the idea of proposing a series of kind of law reforms or policy interventions. At that time, I was considered hopelessly naive. People liked the article for itself, but they just told me that your ideas for law and policy solutions will never happen. And some of that was understandable. There had been attempts over the course of 3 decades, beginning in the early 70s, in a number of southern states to reform this law of partition, and they all failed. So, folks were thinking, what makes you think you're going to have any difference? And the problem is the owners who were impacted fundamentally lack political and economic power. And as a result, no state legislature is going to listen to their concerns. And that's been the history. During the drafting process, as Rebecca said, I was, and I remain only the second African-American that this organization that's had this longest history of promulgating model state statutes, called the Uniform Law Commission, based in Chicago. They've now done 425 model state statutes. One of them is called the Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC. For the big ones, they appoint 2 or 3 people in my position, principal drafters. So maybe they've had, I don't know, like 450 people. And the very fact that I walked into the room when we were in the 3 years we spent drafting, like sometimes people almost fell off their chairs. And one of the meetings where I was at the annual meeting where I was presenting the first draft of the statute, I had one of these uniform law commissioners. These are 350 people, all appointed by governors, so they're very politically connected people. Pulled me aside and he said, you know, you're actually in real danger because it's being marginalized as quote unquote the Black Act that is being drafted by the Black principal drafter. And there was a danger that it was not going to be approved by the Uniform Law Commission. So I quickly had to work on reframing. And part of my reframing is I tried to get as much evidence as possible that this impacted other communities. And I was able to do that by drawing upon some folks I knew in Appalachia, some folks I knew who were working on the Texas-Mexico border with Latinx communities, and then some evidence from some other communities. And ultimately was able to kind of reframe this as something that very much impacts disadvantaged families, but disadvantaged families who are disproportionately, but not exclusively, people of color. And what I actually came to realize was that there were certain drivers of this kind of heirs property phenomenon, which then explains why it's not purely a rural African American problem in terms of these are just some of the 4 points that it's actually pretty widespread actually. All right, so just in drafting this, this is kind of legal. I'm not going to spend a whole lot, but essentially the uniform is called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, does represent the most substantial reform of this area of law, in like 150 years. And there are 3 major features of the act. You might be interested, in the second one, for example. So under this partition law, the courts have 2 big remedies they can order. They can order a physical division of the property and then an allocation of the parcels among the co-owners, or they can order a forced sale. The overwhelming majority of states, in terms of at the state statute level, said that there was a preference for the physical division because that was more consistent with maintaining important property rights. But it was a thin preference because the statute said, well, there's an exception. If ordering a physical division would result in great prejudice, then the forced sale should be the appropriate remedy. But at the state statutory level, the legislatures never defined, well, what is great prejudice? And into that vacuum, in the course of the last 50 years, many state court judges throughout the country developed what I call the economics only test. And they said that when we evaluate whether or not there would be great prejudice from ordering a physical division, the only relevant factor is an economic factor. Is the land more valuable if you keep it together as a whole and order it sold, as opposed to physically dividing that? A lot of my scholarship pushed back on this notion that the economic value should be the only thing taken into account. And I basically, during the drafting act, I totally rejected this economics only test and came up with what I call the totality of the circumstances test that both takes into account kind of an equal measure economic factors, but also non-economic factors such as longstanding ownership within the family. Like, I think it's important if a family's owned it for generations. Does the property have certain cultural or historical significance? Is there somebody using the property in some lawful way where the forced sale would do great harm to them, including using the property for basic shelter? And would a sale substantially reduce their quality of housing, maybe even render them homeless? I actually think those are important values. And so what I think of is that provision adds real substance to what was the previous thin preference for the physical division of the property. The last thing is we ended up coming up with a sales process that replaced sales process mandated in every state that essentially results in a fire sale price where at the forced sale, the owners get pennies on the dollar. And so we replaced it with one that's much more likely to yield a fair market value price and at least enable the family to retain the real estate wealth that is associated with the property. So we've had, as I kind of indicated 25 years ago, the consensus opinion among law professors, among those practicing lawyers, was that there was zero chance that this area of law would be reformed. You know, as Rebecca said, we're actually up to 17 states. The 18th jurisdiction is the United States Virgin Islands. So there's 18 jurisdictions in all. I gave you just kind of a selection of some of the states. As you can see, the photo is with then Governor Nikki Haley in South Carolina. She invited me to a ceremonial signing of the act in her office with two other folks. We have, there's a Hawaii story with Native Hawaiians. In the bottom right, Virginia enacted into law in 2020. The Governor Ralph Northam's office invited me to that signing. I didn't attend because of COVID-19 concerns. There's somebody behind the Governor of Virginia, a tall African-American man. I'll give anybody extra points or credit, bonus points if you can tell me who that person is. Let me just give you a kind of a map of where it's been enacted into law up to this point. And so one of the things is the act, as I indicated, has been, or as I say, it's been enacted into law in every region of the country. I typically say from Hawaii to Florida, from Connecticut to New Mexico, and 3 Midwestern states thrown in, as well as Montana. We have 6 states now where we have introductions in the legislature, our bills in 2021. So one of the things that has helped us in the last couple of years was there's this something known as cooperative federalism. So cooperative federalism entails if there's a provision in a congressional bill that essentially provides incentives for states to take some independent action of their own, whether in terms of regulation or in terms of legislation, right? So it's not mandated, but it's basically an incentive. The 2018 Farm Bill specifically references my model state statute, and it gives incentives to states that have not enacted it into law to do so. Essentially what it says is, in your state, if you have farmers and ranchers who own heirs property, those owners will have greater access to certain USDA programs and services than similarly situated farmers and ranchers who own heirs property in states that don't pass the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. As a direct result of this Farm Bill provision, we have gotten 4 states in the last 2 years to enact the Uniform Act, where we had 0 chance, and that's Florida, Illinois, Mississippi, and Virginia. As a result of this Farm Bill provision, we have like a new unlikely ally, right? If you had told me that a state farm bureau, which is typically not known as a very progressive organization, would be an ally of ours a couple of years ago, I would not have believed it. But the organization that championed our bill in Illinois and Mississippi was the respective farm bureaus. We now have a number of state realtor associations, and that's because the National Association of Realtors has basically acknowledged all the harm they did in participating robustly in redlining, and they've made a commitment in the next couple of years to promote laws that further kind of fair and equitable housing. So I think the last thing I'll leave you with is, in terms of my work in my law and policy work, is we're now seeing, significant success, right? As I indicated, we have 6 states this year where we have introductions, and we have a number of states lined up for the next couple of years, including Minnesota, Louisiana, Kentucky, North Carolina. We're also seeing that as a result of the success of this initial model state statute, at 18 jurisdictions, the Uniform Law Commission, the one area where they've been pretty unsuccessful in their 129 years is their model state statutes in the area of real property. There's been about 40 of them. The median number of states to enact any of those real property acts is 1. The average is 5. We're now at 18, and we're likely to get to 25 by 2025. And as a result of that, the Uniform Law Commission approached me a couple years ago and said, Thomas, based upon this unexpected success of your act, do you have an idea for a second model state statute impacting heirs property owners? And I said, well, funny you should ask, I do. So they just recently accepted my proposal to form a drafting committee to draft this other act to deal with another manifestation. It was one of only 3 acts, drafting committees they approved this year. We're seeing in states such as Virginia, where I've worked hand in glove with this incredible coalition. It was multi-sectoral, from environmental groups to groups who represented disadvantaged landowners of color, to a variety of kind of other stakeholders. They now have developed a package of 3 or 4 additional heirs property bills that they intend to introduce in the next 3 or 4 years. And the first one actually just passed the legislature and now became law as of like 2 weeks ago. The last thing is we're seeing some real positive impact in terms of there's been a substantial reduction in the filing of these abusive partition actions. And we've already had evidence in states such as Georgia and South Carolina, where we're getting evidence that there's substantially higher sales prices in those cases where there is a forced sale. So for example, in a case in Texas, I had a couple of attorneys who contacted me and said, as a result of using the sales procedure in your statute, the property that was subject to a partition sale in this Texas case sold for $2.5 million. And all of the attorneys agreed that if they had used the sales process mandated under the general background law, that the property would have sold for nothing more than $1 million. I'm sorry, I had one last slide. I think in the context of my work, one of the things I totally rejected was this notion that I heard from some people when I began my work. They said that, nothing can be done for these folks. It's just an unpleasant fact of life that they lack the power, that they, at Black landowners, basically occupy a position where they're just structurally set up to be taken advantage of. And unfortunately, nothing can be done about that. I think the history is much different from them. It's a history of crisis and opportunities. It's a history of great disappointments, but sometimes followed by great successes. And what I'm seeing in the last few years is not only was the success of some of my legal reform work just taken most people by complete surprise, because it was viewed as impossible. But what I've seen in the last several years is this burgeoning social movement of African Americans who really want to get back to the land. They want to get back to farming. And oftentimes, the New York Times had a great article a few weeks ago about how oftentimes they want to do it in a way that is environmentally sustainable. And then somebody recently referred to, as I was talking, there was in the COVID stimulus bill, there was this provision where there's basically $1 billion being allocated to help Black farmers and other socioeconomically disadvantaged farmers, in addition to $4 billion of debt relief. And I was actually asked to testify last week in the US Senate, and my schedule couldn't permit it, but I was talking to the person who asked me to testify, and he referred to this period as a Jubilee time or a Jubilee year. We are seeing civil rights being taken seriously in USDA. The Senators Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Elizabeth Warren introduced something called the Justice for Black Farmers Act several weeks ago, and I was asked by some of the staff to help draft that act. So I did participate in a minor way in drafting that act. But that act is already becoming a template. Some of the Justice for Black Farmers Act was included in this COVID relief measure. We're starting to see that the USDA is looking at other aspects where maybe it can't pass Congress, but they have the discretion to enact parts of it or to draw upon parts of it. And there's also now some states that are drawing upon this Justice for Black Farmers Act at the state level, setting up things called like equity commissions, looking at if there are barriers that the state has that are preventing farmers of color from participating fully in the variety of kind of state agricultural programs. Okay, so let me end it there, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Thomas, so much. That was just an incredible flyover, and I know, as someone who works in field research with communities, how much time and talking and listening and learning you just flew over for us, not just with the communities who are at the heart of this, but with all of those that have joined you in implementation. It's super, super inspiring. I would like to introduce right now a member of our UMSEAS community who's going to segue a little bit into our Q&A period for you. Cara Thuringer is with us today, and I want to pass the mic to Cara, who is a second-year master's student concentrating in both environmental justice and geospatial data science. At U of M, also a teacher, a graduate student instructor who has a crucial role in the International Studies 101 course, helping students build vocabulary and critical thinking about persistent challenges to global stability and emergent trends in geopolitics. And I think so much of your work has been conducted in this domestic frame, but has so much relevance for those of us working broadly on land loss and land grabs globally. Prior to grad school, Cara worked at CNA, a federally funded research and development center for the U.S. Department of the Navy, where she worked on national security dimensions of climate change and energy technology and water stress development, focusing on the Arctic. But her research interests also center on justice and equity issues in large-scale land conservation and the influence of capitalism on social values of land. Cara grew up in South Dakota. She has degrees from Montana State and in environmental studies and film and photography. So like yourself, toggling between more humanistic, humanities type thinking and real change making and policy. Cara's a Truman scholar, an Udall scholar, a Boren scholar. I could go on, but I won't. I want to cede the mic to Cara to ask a few questions.
Thank you, first of all, Dr. Mitchell, for being here and for sharing your remarks with us. And thank you, Dr. Hardin, for that very kind introduction. My peers and I deeply appreciate the time and knowledge that both of you have shared with us this afternoon and beyond. Personally, I really love hearing about unlikely partners, which can be so transformational in passing crucial policies such as the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, and hearing about people who refuse to accept the idea that nothing can be done for vulnerable communities in legally complex situations. As Dr. Hardin mentioned at the start of our time, we are thinking here at SEAS about how we acknowledge violence and harm in ways that are substantive rather than performative, particularly with respect to land acknowledgements. And I think one of the ways that we do that is we think about the connections between dispossession of the original tenants of this land that I am personally geographically located in, as well as the conversations that have brought us onto the Zoom call today. So with that, I would like to start by acknowledging that dispossession affects rural as well as urban, and it harms individuals, families, and communities. What Dr. Mitchell's work shows us is the details of how such theft reverberates through generations, and how we should not take no way as an answer as we work to confront these systematic injustices. I think it's also important that we acknowledge that here in southeastern Michigan, we are living, working, and learning on the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe people, the Anishinaabe people who are also known as the people of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Wyandot nations, who lived on this land and stewarded this land before it became known to Western society as the Great Lakes region. To this day, the University of Michigan continues to benefit financially from this land, which was ceded to the federal government in the 1817 Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids. Since the attempted forced removal of Native American peoples and communities from this region, the historical ties to the land and the origins of the university have become obscured and forgotten. We take a moment, first and foremost, to recognize the history and to begin to uncover this history that, that for so long has been ignored. In this session, we acknowledged the violence, theft, and genocide inflicted on Indigenous peoples, as well as the violence and brutality inflicted on those who were stolen from their homelands and brought to North America as slaves. We recognize that this exploitation did not end with the emancipation, and we stand in solidarity and allyship to eliminate white supremacy and threats to Black life. Finally, we acknowledge that these words are not enough. but that they serve as a crucial reminder that we all must take the actions needed to restore right relations with the Anishinaabe, First People of the land, as well as to address the systemic harms of slavery, discrimination, and racism. With that, I want to transition to some thoughts that I had in reaction to the remarks that you shared with us today, Dr. Mitchell, and I would just encourage those of you who might have questions to please share those using the Q&A feature as I share these observations. My own research is looking at land use and land tenure issues in the Intermountain West. And I'm struck by some similarities between your work and observations around mineral leasing rights on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. Fort Berthold is home to the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribes, which are referred to as the MHA Nation or the three affiliated tribes. Fort Berthold is also the site of a significant part of the Bakken oil deposit. Attempts to secure extraction rights on Fort Berthold have threatened communal land ownership models similar to the tenancy in common structures that you yourself research. Fort Berthold underwent a similar process of forced partition of land in order to clear the way for the sale of mineral rights prior to the development of the Bakken oil fields. Similarly, the native communities on Fort Berthold have the same characteristics of vulnerability, more likely to be low income, a lack of access to legal services, and they hold property in an area that is going rapid and intensive development. This leads me to think that there are ways that your scholarship could be leveraged to support communities facing a run on their property rights due to opportunities for extractive industries. Could you help us to understand how the Uniform Partition of Heirs Act, which has not been enacted in North Dakota, could support communities such as the Fort Berthold tribal communities in managing natural resource extraction?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things I kind of think of my work as concentric circles, starting with my initial research in the rural South with rural African Americans, but then kind of realizing that this phenomenon really is a phenomenon that implicates disadvantaged families and communities with kind of common ownership arrangements. And so just in terms of the background, tenancy in common law itself, we've ended up finding out that it impacts, poor whites in Appalachia, Latinx in the Southwest. It seems to be the same pattern in all of these kind of different communities. And so, there are a couple of states where, if you have tenancy in common ownership, that is different. Obviously when we're talking about Native American or Indian law, the levels of complexity are mind-blowing, right? And you have to kind of know, well, what is for any particular Native American family or tribe, how do they own the land? Is it in a trust status or not, right? And for the family, is it in trust or not? And there's different answers, right, for different families and different kind of communities. So there are definitely, Native American families who own tenancy in common ownership, and the Uniform Act would apply to such families, right? Just as it applies in the context of the Native Hawaiian families that ended up getting the protections of them. And so for those families, we've been successful in some states that have high kind of oil and gas or mineral, including Texas. We have run into some political problems in Kansas and West Virginia. And the major opposition was from the kind of extractive kind of industries. But separate and apart from the Uniform Act itself is it's not kind of a precise overlay, but there are commonalities between heirs property ownership and then the problem of fractionated ownership with Indian trust land. Right. So one of the things I actually hope to do in the next few years is to kind of work with people who are working in the kind of in Indian country on these fractional issues implicating kind of trust status property, and kind of like sketch out where are the similarities, where are the differences, and are there ways for us to kind of work cooperatively to advance kind of both agendas, right? So, I know folks at like the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. There's, I don't know if you know Janie Hip, who's in Arkansas. She's kind of a friend. So I'm having some preliminary discussions about trying to extend the work in a way that could be mutually beneficial.
I know we have a question in the Q&A feature as well. We might want to read out.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, those parallels and those opportunities. One of our attendees in the audience here asked, in Michigan, which communities have been and currently are most likely to be impacted by the Uniform Heirs Property Act, and what would be the best way to advocate for the act in Michigan?
Sure. So I think one of the things, it was kind of out of necessity when my act was almost killed in the drafting because it was being seen as just purely through a racial lens. And the Uniform Law Commission is an elite body. It's 85% or 80% white men, average age 65. So, kind of reframing in the ways that we did. But another thing that I've been, trying to break through for 10 or 15 years was to tell folks, this is not just a rural problem, let alone a rural Southern problem. If you look on that PowerPoint, I said there were 4 drivers: low income, low wealth, lack of access to affordable legal services, high rates, in part because of the lack of access to legal services, but also sometimes to distrust of the legal system, low rates of will making or estate planning. And then as you were talking about, like in North Dakota, you have property that oftentimes communities of color, when they acquired it, was not considered prime real estate. And that's both in the rural space, but also in cities. But then there has been a rapid appreciation in terms of the real estate values over time with respect to that property. Some in the rural context, sometimes you're dealing with an agricultural land on the urban fringe in the context of urban sprawl. But in cities, you're dealing with gentrification, right? And so I remember just, I've had a lot of media interviews. And the last few years, I was just trying to tell reporters, this is not just a rural problem. And then the article would come out and would say, the Heirs property problem is a rural African-American problem. I just was so frustrating. Until 2 years ago, there was an investigative journalist for one of the big TV stations in New York City, NY1. And she actually has a law degree and a master's in communication. She studied at University of Baltimore for a professor who actually highlights my work. So she, when she stumbled across this heirs property problem in New York City, she actually had a good foundation. But what she found out was that in New York City, pretty much in every borough, from Manhattan to Queens to Brooklyn, that real estate speculators were preying upon African Americans who had high equity properties. Part of the reason they had high equity properties, these families typically acquired their like brownstones or single family homes in like 1950 at the height of redlining. So for those families to buy the property, they actually had to pay in cash. And so or mostly cash. So their properties were paid off a long time ago. And then all of a sudden you got massive gentrification and a spike in real estate values, which then just made their property ownership a target. And so I suspect that in Detroit, for example, and other cities in Michigan, I suspect you have the same phenomenon. You're going to have the same low incidence of will making. You're going to have the same dynamic of property owners who are property rich but cash poor. And in some of the, in at least some parts of those cities, you're going to have gentrification pressures. So I would, be actually shocked if that wasn't a dynamic in the major cities in Michigan. And then just in terms of families who own agricultural land, now maybe we're talking about middle-class white families in Michigan, you're likely to have a similar dynamic. And that's what we saw in Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri. The act really was driven by the concern of middle-class white farmers. And there had been a case actually that got massive amounts of attention in Iowa where a a white farm family. It was down to a brother and a sister. The sister was on farm working it. The brother was in, I don't know, Chicago, and he just saw $1. He wanted to monetize that. 500-acre farm, had been in the family for 4 generations. Court ordered it sold, although easily it could have been divided. And that just led to a massive amount of media attention in Iowa. And then that was the catalyst for getting the act. So I suspect in Michigan, you likely have those types of families as well. Oh, I'm sorry. And the last thing is, so if anybody wanted, so one of the things I've been intimately involved in, almost every state where we've gotten it enacted, I play usually a big role, from working behind the scenes to try to generate interest in the legislature, to then working with the various committees where our bills get assigned, to testifying in the legislature, and then also to trying to help either catalyze the creation of a coalition, or if a coalition's already together, I worked hand in glove. So in Michigan, like right now, so I think that's like, I think of my work as both bottom up in terms of coalition building, but then top down, because I do have access to some of the elite organizations. So in Michigan, there would have to, I think, there would have to be a number of interested parties that might be interested in forming a coalition. And I'd be happy to work with anybody. In 2020, we had amazing coalitions in Virginia and Florida that I worked with. And so they're real models. So I've now been in some other states like North Carolina. When folks approach me, I said, go talk to the people in North Carolina, in Virginia and Florida, and they will give you a tutorial on how to put together this coalition. And then once you've done that, I'll work with you. But anyway, so I'd be happy if there's interest in terms of the kind of the coalition building.
I think certainly there's probably a lot of interest in this community. I know that at the University of Michigan, we have several scholars and advocates that are looking at risks to urban property owners in Detroit who are facing, may own land that is now desirable from a development standpoint, but is not currently occupied. And I know that there has been, I think about the work of one of my classmates, Jordan Larson, in looking at how historical redlining, but also a variety of other factors going on within Detroit are creating threats to urban property owners due to rising gentrification within the city.
Yeah, and I'll tell you one thing that just, I told you about the state farm bureaus being this unlikely ally, but it really, and actually in some ways I'm surprised this didn't happen earlier, when we fundamentally changed the sales process, right? From these auction sales at the courthouse, where there's very thin notice to the public. Prospective buyers have no right to inspect the property, and usually in most states at the auction at the courthouse, the winning bid has to be paid in cash that day. And as a result of all those factors, you're just not going to get a good price. And so under our this open market sales procedure, what the court does is they appoint a real estate broker to list the property for its fair market value, appraised value. And then that broker has to use all commercially reasonable practices like they do with properties in their normal inventory. There's no artificial deadline. And people can make offers contingent on getting financing, like when you buy a single family home yourself, right? So I always kind of thought that we might have the opportunity to get support from realtors, because under the auction sales at the courthouse, no realtor participates. So I kind of thought that realtors could, do well by doing good, right? Because they get a commission. But that, for whatever reason, and part of it is I just didn't have time to then really systematically try to get their support. But on their own volition, because now promoting fair housing and equitable housing is now one of their central things they want to accomplish in the next few years. So I found out a few months ago that the California Association of Realtors had decided to champion the UPHPA there. And for a variety of reasons, we thought we had no chance in California in the next 5 to 10 years. So we weren't even focusing on California. But then that led to the California introduction. There was actually a former student of mine who works with the California Association, a former student from Wisconsin who actually is in Michigan. She introduced me to the senior governmental affairs person at the National Association of Realtors, and they had me do a whole webinar for all of their state associations at a conference. And as a result of that, now I've had, I don't know, 6 state associations of realtors that are now working with us. And I'm sure the Michigan Association of Realtors would be willing to entertain supporting it.
Those are really interesting tactical insights, Thomas. And I appreciate very much the ways that you're able to move between sort of theoretical and tactical registers with this work. It's really, really unique and really useful, I think, for a group of learners and engaged scholars like ours. Cara, any last words as we hit the end of the hour here?
I mean, I could go on with many, many questions, but I want to be respectful of both our attendees' time as well as your own time. And so I think I would like to just close by saying that this session has been, I think for me, incredibly helpful as somebody who doesn't have a super deep legal background in beginning to understand land tenure in a new way and understand property rights and how different tools can be leveraged in order to support landowners who are vulnerable to predatory land acquisition processes. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Dr. Hardin to close this out.
Rebecca, can I just say one last thing?
Please do, absolutely.
For me, it's just what I've enjoyed about my work is I find it very human. And, you know, the source of it initially was visiting these grassroots communities or these marginal communities or disadvantaged communities where they were, right? Whether it was in rural Alabama or rural Mississippi or in, you know, Appalachia. And I just, you know, I really got a lot out of spending time with these communities and families at churches, at town hall meetings, and diners. And what I also, in terms of then making the transition to the kind of law and policy side is, I think one of the great successes is it's been work that, you know, there is some top down, right? So we have allies with the ABA, with these realtors. There's also very bottom up. And one of the things I was very happy is in the 3 years of drafting this, I kind of catalyzed the involvement of grassroots organizations, public interest law firms, community-based organizations. And my thinking was certainly among property professors in the United States, law professors, I had the most expertise. But it was an area that was grossly understudied and under-theorized. And I realized there were limits to my knowledge, right? That these organizations that had worked in the field, in the trenches for decades, they just knew a lot more. So I helped them decide to form a coalition, and they participated in the drafting, right? In the conference rooms that we were at. It was called the Heirs Property Retention Coalition. And there were times in the drafting we would come to a fork in the road and we said, okay, we're trying to address this problem. But essentially the only people who really have data is these community-based organizations, these grassroots. So we turned to them and said, tell us, how does it actually work on the ground? And then they gave us their input and we're like, okay, we'll draft it this way. And so I think that having their robust participation, and the Uniform Law Commission told me it was like the only time in their entire history they've actually had grassroots groups at the table. They didn't know that I kind of was the catalyst, but you know, they were just saying, oh my God, they have so much to offer. And then because they were then taken seriously in the drafting process, when we've gone state to state to try to get it enacted into law, we've been able to call upon some of those organizations to say, okay, we need you. So to me, it's just been, you know, I find myself in this very kind of privileged position that I can do the work the way I like to do it, and involve all kinds of people, whether they're grassroots or, you know, sometimes I, you know, enjoy working with the elite organizations. I mean, I know that in some ways I'm kind of like, I'm very unusual for them. And sometimes I find that kind of interesting. You know, but there's also good people in those too. So yeah, a lot of good people, right? So okay, so let me end it on that note.
Well, I love that note, and I love the note that you've both struck in this brief conversation. Way too brief for the richness of the material that you've presented us today, Thomas, of course. But we like to think of this, and I note that last week's guest, also a wonderful discussion, is here with us listening in today and offering up insights and questions. So I very much hope if you have a moment, you'll join us again. We have next week Esme Murdoch, philosopher, currently a Mellon postdoctoral scholar at Penn State, but thinking and talking about, actually I'll drop the title into the chat, the role of land in corporeality and environmental justice education. A lot of your comments point to a problem I think a lot of us face, which is, you are a mediator, you're a broker of change. You're you're working to connect and catalyze. You use this language. How does one learn to do that? Well, by doing it, right? And by sharing what you're learning in the doing. So I want to just thank you again for that sort of hard to put in a box set of reflections and insights about the pleasure and challenges of that kind of work in this world that we've all inherited. It's really powerful, Thomas, and it's really motivating, I think, for many of our students who are working on these issues from a place of relative isolation in the pandemic. So this community building is one that we really do care a lot about, and we want to thank you for your time. I mean, for you to say that the U.S. Senate was trying to get you to come in and talk to them, but you just didn't have time, and you took time for us today. I think we all feel pretty special, to be honest, and pretty grateful. This is, I hope, the beginning of further work and thinking together. A friend and colleague of ours, Bernadette Atohene, will be with us in a few weeks talking about some of the very kinds of intersections that Cara catalyzed in her comments about the urban-rural interface here. And I really do think we are looking at a kind of a cumulative conversation in this series. We're also working on open access, open source modules that can be used for teaching and learning on these fronts in community organizations or classrooms. And that's something we'll circle back around with on you. Jordan Larson, mentioned by Cara, is doing one on redlining right now that could be used on cell phones or computers to help people understand what redlining was and how it leads us into these kinds of opportunities for change now. And so I really do want to thank you for all the doors you've opened and for all the questions you've answered, and for the ones that will come next. We will be in touch. We wish you all the best in your ongoing work. And we want to thank you for that fundamental impulse, which is to hear, oh no, that would be great, but it can't be done. And then just do it. It's incredible. I'm really delighted that you're getting the recognition you deserve after the many years of work you've done on these issues. May you get more.
Yeah, I thank you. And I was actually just at dinner last night. I actually feel like a real bond with, SEAS, in that I'm kind of an accidental lawyer. My real passions growing up were, anthropology, and I thought I was going to work on climate justice. And then somehow a variety of things happened in my life that, ended up taking a different path, but still kind of.
Well, for now, Thomas, for now.
Right. But anyway, so I'm happy to kind of learn about SEAS and learn about this program. And Bernadette's actually a great friend.
Right
so
on.
I hope to continue to.
We will be in dialogue, and welcome to the community. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll keep you abreast of further conversations in this space and in our production of new curricular tools and educational tools. Thanks to all those who tuned in today. Please do join us next week for Esme Murdoch's amazing talk, and I will keep you all up to date on the links. Please do not hesitate to reach out with feedback about anything that didn't go well for you today, that you're looking to improve as we move across week to week the rest of the spring together and into summer. Spring is coming. And all of our thoughts with you guys in Texas. I know it's been a rough winter, and it can't have been easy, Thomas, to make room for this, but thanks for doing it. And onward, everyone onward.
Thank you.
Cara, I will stop the recording here, and we can debrief a little bit.